You drink coffee, I drink coffee, just about everyone drinks coffee. So why bother with anything but the best? Darren's Coffee is roasted at his new shop in Claremont, Indiana. And coming soon, you can order on Amazon and support the show by using Scott Horton's affiliate link. DarrensCoffee.com. Because everyone deserves to drink great coffee.
All right, y'all. Scott Horton Show. Check out the archives at scotthorton.org. 4,000-something interviews going back to 2003 there. Sign up for the podcast feed as well there, scotthorton.org. And follow me on Twitter at Scott Horton Show. All right, introducing Catherine Lutz. She is from the Cost of War Project. That's the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. And, boy, when they say cost of war, these are the people who are really keeping track of all of it for us. And since we're here, just a few days past the 15th anniversary of the beginning of the bombing of Afghanistan, the war that continues on there, seems like a pretty good time to try to catch up on what all we've spent and maybe even some of our lost opportunity costs and the rest. Welcome to the show, Catherine. How are you?
Oh, great. Thanks for having me, Scott.
I really appreciate you joining us on the show here. So, I know it's kind of hard to parse, but can you give us a ballpark on not just the DoD budget every year, but on the actual cost of the Afghan war, the Iraq war, and the various drone wars in Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, the regime change in Libya, and the billions spent in Syria, these kinds of things. Do you have an overall cost of the terror war ballpark estimate for us today?
Well, we haven't added in that long list. We've mainly focused for now on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan, and some of the other additions to the costs of the military that have come as a result of the war on terror. So we don't have a complete picture, but we do have bottom line number of $4.8 trillion for the cost to date. And then in addition to that, costs for interest on the debt for these past appropriations is going to add another potentially $8 trillion. So this is again a huge kind of unfathomable number in some ways. But it's just part of the picture. The real costs are the human costs, of course, the body count, the destroyed communities in Iraq and Afghanistan and Pakistan, the loss of civil liberties and the sort of erosion in the rule of law, such as it is, that has been involved with things like our detention practices and tortures and torture and so on. So the human costs, refugee numbers are phenomenal. 8 million people still displaced just from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So we have to start with those human numbers and then also try and wrap our minds around these financial numbers. Mm-hmm.
Well, and the dollars themselves, that only just represents, the means of exchange of real wealth between people. So it sounds like maybe it's more crass and more greedy or whatever, but that's $5 trillion, and you add the other 8 to it, just in interest on the debt. That's all money that could have been spent on improving people's lives, saving their lives, feeding them, coming up with new distribution methods for other forms of wealth to reach new customers and these kinds of things. We'll never know the lost opportunity cost just from the money spent. And then, as you mentioned, there's the psychic cost of turning into a bunch of barbarian torturer murderers in the name of avenging ourselves from the 9/11 attack and all this kind of thing that can't be measured in any kind of, numerical terms, but are more a matter of quality and soul that, also definitely, mean just as much or more. But when you talk about $8 trillion just in paying the interest on the debt of the money the government borrowed to wage these 2 wars, I mean, really you lump in the AfPak thing, as the government does as part of the, Pakistan as part of the Afghan war. I mean, that's just unbelievable. It's,
right. No,
it ought to be
absolutely
unbelievable, but it's not, unfortunately, I guess.
Yeah, no, and I think the thing that we're trying to understand is, how to do the math. And, most people just look at the Pentagon budget, the budget, that has been earmarked for the wars. And, that's just really not sufficient. There's so many additional costs that are buried in other parts of the federal and even state budgets. We have a couple of researchers who looked, at a couple of the states and looked at how even, again, low state taxes, some of them are really, ultimately making their way sometimes through caring for veterans, but to deal with the costs of the wars. But, to go back to your other point too about, what these numbers really mean, it's true. It's about human values, and, we can make a rough estimate of the kinds of things that haven't happened as a result of spending the money on the wars rather than on clean energy or healthcare, education. You look at just the recent crash in Hoboken, and in the Times this morning, there's a story about the Chris Christie's severe cutting of the budget for public transportation, and that has to be accounted as part of the problem in this crash. That equipment was not updated. Safety equipment was not there that should have been there. And the states have been, again, cutting their budgets in part because they're getting less money from the federal government, because it's spending it on DOD. Mm-hmm. So, the spillover effects and again, the sort of domestic body count, has begun to build up as well, quite literally.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, I mean, you have, all that tax money that could have gone to keeping people employed or employing them in new ventures. And this sounds, maybe greedy or self-interested or whatever, but I think just, the ability of a mom or a dad to be able to afford to go on a family vacation once every couple of years or something like that. It sounds like, white people first world problems or this or that kind of thing. But, I don't know, family vacations when I was a kid are some of the most, memorable parts of my life of being part of my family. And that's huge. And when you're talking about the money that could have gone to people doing, spending quality time on just leisure with their people, that's worth uncalculable trillions, I think. And it sounds like, it's nothing compared to grand projects or whatever, but it's the whole point of being alive, right? Really? So that's the way I think of it. Some guy couldn't buy the dinky little boat he wanted to buy, or his daughter had to settle for going to a college that was lesser than the one that they really wanted to put her in, or these kinds of things. That money was spent killing people in Iraq, and that was why they couldn't do the thing that they dreamed that they wanted to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, that, as you say, that is a first world set of problems, but the more basic problem of again, people dying earlier than they would have. People, shortened lives, more illness, as a result of the failure of government to protect people's health through these kinds of investments. So I think, we have, increasing, some third world problems here as well in our country.
Yeah, good way to put it.
Yeah. But to go to those numbers too, I think, when people just look at what's being spent, the DoD budget is really just a fraction of the whole. Amazingly, that's just $1.6 trillion that's been spent directly on the wars. If you look at the Pentagon accountants, right? But the Pentagon base budget has gone up much faster than expected as a result of these wars. So the war climate in Congress has led to lots of additional trillions or billions being spent on things that are not supposedly or directly relevant to the war, to waging the wars on terror. So we've got those base budget additional dollars. We've got veterans care and disability. And here's where I think, people have a very limited sense sometimes of what the war, or how long the wars are going to last. Even if they ended tomorrow, we have, people who are going to need care decades from now. We still have veterans family members who are being taken care of from the Spanish-American War. And this is something that, hard to believe, but true. It's on the DoD website, where they, count the survivors of the dependents who are survivors of people who were in that war. So for this war on terror, we're going to have into the 22nd century, people who are, having to, needing care and, needing this kind of funding. And again, this is just in the United States. In Iraq and Afghanistan, those wars have destabilized the region, and of course, untold sort of economic costs will accrue to the people of those countries into the 22nd century as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a million new widows or a million new orphans at least in Iraq from Iraq War II, and then Iraq War III now continuing on. And, to get back to that, I know that you talk about on your website here, you talk about the difference between direct and indirect death in these wars. But it's, it's good that you count that. We don't want to let the U.S. skate for somebody dies of an easily curable disease because they're in the middle of a war zone and there's no economy and there's no health care, there's no hospital, there's 10 checkpoints between here and the hospital, and so they just die. Well, that's the fault of the war, too, even if they didn't take a bullet. And in the Iraq War alone, we're talking about at least near 1 million people. It's hard to really say when you're measuring excess death rates and all that kind of thing. But, we're talking about just levels of deprivation that Americans who weren't in that war have no experience with, not even in the very poorest parts of our country.
Yeah, no, this is a really important concept to understand, is how wars have these sort of reverberating effects out on people's health, and beyond the sort of bombs and the bullets and the landmines that we're more familiar with thinking about. Just to give one example, the cancer rates in Iraq have gone up as a result of some of the additional exposures that people have had. But as you point out, the destruction of the medical system in Iraq, the killing and the flight of doctors, the decimation of the very advanced infrastructure of healthcare that Iraq had before the war and before the sanctions. All of that long war has resulted in, again, many, many more deaths than would have otherwise occurred for lack of medical care. But one other kind of thing that we can also look at is increased rates of injury as infrastructure and buildings are bombed. People don't have to be injured in the initial bomb attack to be injured later. As Iraq, for example, lost its electrical system, the bombing of power plants and other facilities resulted in people having to jury rig electricity to their homes with the use of generators and connecting up to neighbors. And what the public health epidemiologists have found is higher rates of falls and electrocutions, some portion of which are likely to have been accounted for by people climbing up and trying to take care of their own electrical system on their roof, getting electrocuted, falling. So it's just these cascading multiple effects that result in much higher rates of death and injury as an indirect result of the war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you mentioned the cancers, and everybody knows that, at least the reports, there is, I guess, still conflicting, arguments among scientists about the depleted uranium. Sure seems like Busby and those others have a strong case to me. But one thing that I don't think is really in dispute at all is the toxic nature of the smoke from the burn pits at the American bases in Iraq and Afghanistan. And, there's a new book out about that by Joseph Hickman, the Guantanamo murder whistleblower, who wrote about it and has a whole section about how it's very likely that this is how Vice President Joe Biden's son died, from his tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, stationed right next to the burn pits, or what caused, I forgot what it was, but it was a pretty unique kind of cancer. And it's the kind of thing that a lot of soldiers are coming down with. And if that's how the soldiers are coming down with it during a 1-year tour of duty over there and that kind of thing, You can just imagine what it's like for the people of Samara who, can't move, who are stuck there, and this is where they live, is next to a burn pit of who knows what kinds of insane molecules that only burning American equipment could create,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's just, it's like poisoning them. Straight kind of poison.
That's exactly.
And just
exactly right.
and disregard a nice measure of the disregard of the American military for their own enlisted men and for the people that they're supposedly over there saving as well, I think.
I've always been impressed with Stan Goff, who's who's a ex-Special Forces and has written on the U.S. military and militarism, and his great coinage is, the U.S. military loves its soldiers like Tyson loves its chickens. And, the idea that we have so many U.S. service members who have been injured in this way is, again, a testament to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. He died just after the terror war really got going, I guess. But Colonel David Hackworth was the same way. He was, I guess, the most decorated Vietnam veteran ever or something. But he had a site called Soldiers for the Truth, and basically his entire frame of reference was that the war was between the officer corps and the enlisted men. And his job in the world was to protect the enlisted men from the officers, who were their greatest enemies in the world, far more than any other country or group of terrorists or anybody else. And that was his whole frame of reference. And without even knowing the details, you just know that if David Hackworth thought that was necessary for him to be that, then it really was. You know what I mean? And that was a big part of why he warned against invading Iraq. It wasn't because he was a big old bleeding heart liberal or something like that. It was because he saw the disaster coming and how bad it would be for the people that he cared about the most, and that was the enlisted Army and Marines who were going to be doing the killing and dying over there. It's just like reading a Joseph Heller novel or something. Seriously, seems like.
Well, yeah, he lived through it himself.
Right. Okay, so now Afghanistan. I wonder how much, do you have a number or a couple of different numbers for the military occupation and or State Department, so-called aid spending and these kinds of things? Because I was hoping to drop a couple of jaws in the listening audience.
Well, the State Department USAID spending on the wars has been about $110 billion, so that it's not a small amount, but to me, what's so interesting is to see the way in which reconstruction spending in Iraq and Afghanistan, which sounds like a positive, how that money has been allocated. This is money that supposedly is helping the people of Iraq and Afghanistan to recover from the war, even as they continue to be ongoing wars. But in fact, when you look at the Special Inspector General for Afghan or Iraqi reconstruction numbers, you see that the majority of those dollars are being spent on the security forces of those countries. In other words, what they're reconstructing or what they're constructing is a large military and police force out of all proportion to the ability of those countries to support them, to sustain them into the future. And again, and as opposed to spending on repairing things like the kinds of infrastructure that have been destroyed in the war. I mean, some dollars go in that direction, but nothing sufficient to get the country back to those two countries back to where they were before the wars. Of course, both of them experienced serial war, so you have to go back several decades at this point to really sort of see where those countries were headed in terms of their well-being of the population. Yeah. But looking at those numbers and those reports, it's clear that most of those monies have been spent for contractors when they are spent on things like healthcare or education. So they've been spent on construction of buildings. Contracts to some of the big U.S. military industries, like Black and Veatch, like Dynacor. And, so it's really been a real boondoggle for the corporations who have, been getting these very, very large contracts.
Hey, Scott Horton here to tell you about this great new book by Michael Swanson, The War State. In The War State, Swanson examines how Presidents Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy both expanded and fought to limit the rise of the new national security state after World War II. If this nation is ever to live up to its creed of liberty and prosperity for everyone, we are going to have to abolish the empire. Know your enemy. Get The War State by Michael Swanson. It's available at your local bookstore or at Amazon.com in Kindle or in paperback. Just click the book in the right margin at scotthorton.org or thewarstate.com.
Mm. Well, I hate to say it, but I'm predicting a lot more of that in Afghanistan coming up because they're right at the point where withdrawal led to the conclusion that we all knew it would, the re-rise of the Taliban. I mean, the occupation is what really gave them their boost, but then withdrawal has just given them all this space to come right back again, and there's just no way to spin this as a victory and end it. Obama already called off the troop reductions and said he's holding it at 8,500 troops and God knows how many mercs and spies and everybody else there, drone pilots and whoever in the country through the end of his presidency. And looking at, who we're looking at, seems like everybody seems to agree that now it's in the bag for Hillary. Well, she's not going to back down. She can only double down. And Trump has barely commented on Afghanistan, but where he has, he's said, oh yeah, no, we have to stay there forever because Pakistan has nukes or something. So, I would certainly predict that he's not going to back down and leave Afghanistan. And I don't know how in the world she could. Politically, I don't even think she would want to. So I don't know what she's going to do other than try to find, maybe even rehire Petraeus and send him back to do another surge, do something, because how can they leave? They've lost.
Well, I think the problem is the narrative, right? All of these dollars and all of these bodies that have piled up over 15 years are all in service to this larger narrative in which military force can make the world a better place, right? That, you solve problems by throwing the U.S. military at it. And the U.S. military, again, has the right to do whatever it wants, wherever it wants. So I think this, it's the story that is so distorting and makes it so difficult to imagine our way as a country out of the problem. So every time the military withdraws, correlation, people assume that's causation, right? When the U.S. military leaves, that somehow, that's why things have gone badly, as opposed to, the fact of using military solutions in the first place as the go-to, answer.
Sure. No, yeah, you're absolutely right. No, I agree with you. Yeah, I'm just going, basically by the frame of the narrative, which is, you can't leave unless you can call it a victory. And so they're kind of stuck. And yeah, I mean, it's absolutely right that the Taliban, it's not even that they were defeated. They gave up. They were like, yeah, Karzai, he's not perfect, but he's a good Pashtun and he's a good Muslim, and that's cool. They basically retired. They basically just, they gave up. They couldn't stand against the new order backed by America in Afghanistan. And so they left. It took, the escalation by America against them to get them to keep growing and growing and become the monster that they are now, where I don't know if they're really a threat to just march right into Kabul at this point, like the fall of Saigon, but it's pretty easy to imagine that they might be in that position within a few years.
Well, this is why we're doing this project, and this Cost of War project is a large group of people. There's about 40 experts of various kinds, scholars and people who've worked in those two countries with NGOs and in other capacities. All those people have been trying to put together this information on what the wars have cost, in human and financial terms, because these arguments about the war being won or lost or having to continue or not, are all being made in a complete, vacuum of information, right? without knowing what the costs are, how can you argue for the benefits of anything, right? And so
Right.
even again, that this sort of kind of amoral cost benefit analysis requires that you have the data, right? And I think this is where, the U.S. government has completely failed to do the sort of most basic due diligence on what has been spent and how many people have died and will continue to die as a result of deciding to do things, with this sort of blunt instrument of the military. Mm-hmm. So I think that's where we really need to, go back to the question of, how many people have died, how many people continue to die, and how many lost opportunities are there for, the use of those resources.
Mm-hmm. Well, part of it is we just face the bias of not being in power, and so what do we know about it? How could a layman like you or me be able to say that these experts are wrong even after all this money spent and all this failure in their wake? Still, as any Democrat or Republican will tell you the exact same phrase, well, the president has secret information that we don't know about, and so what can you do except accept what they're doing? And so even after years of this, and I don't really mean for people who are very interested, because they all have their own opinions, but I think the average person just figures, hey, if we've been at war for 15 years, one way or the other, it's because we had to be. Otherwise, it just wouldn't be this way. It's presumed to be a self-correcting system. And so the fact that it's carried on is sort of becomes the proof of how necessary it was. So it's really an entire change of mindset that we have to break through, that not only was it $5 trillion spent, but it was $5 trillion blown, and, et cetera, like that, and try to get people to come to that conclusion themselves, I guess, because they're not going to hear it from us. They got to hear it from either Smedley Butler or from their own mind, that this just can't be worth it when you look at this level of failure. But I don't think we're really there yet. I think mostly people shrug and go, well, the Navy SEALs are out there keeping me safe somehow, somewhere,
Well, journalism is really responsible here to take this kind of information and disseminate it, right? When you look at when the New York Times, for example, covers the wars, they cover strategy, they cover occasional attacks, but they don't often want to use this kind of information to really get at these trade-offs, right? And I think this unfortunately is mostly what a lot of people do care about. They care about how this affects me, and that there are many people for whom this information would be really determinative. So I think to the extent that we can circulate these numbers, and that's one of the things that we work on is trying to make sure that the data is not just there, but that it circulates, and that people know, again, what the job opportunity costs. We have an economist who's done that for us, tried to estimate how many jobs would have been created if the federal spending on the wars had instead been federal spending on education or healthcare. And maybe some of your listeners have heard this kind of analysis before. It's been done before with other parts of military spending in the past during the Cold War. But again, it's hundreds of thousands of jobs, because military spending creates fewer jobs than those other categories of federal spending.
Sure. Yeah, because all they make is weapons of destruction that are useless for any other task. So they don't create. It's not like they're creating machines that create other machines for people to use or anything like that. They create machines that blow up and destroy property and people and wealth and all of that. And, it's funny because, I'm more of a libertarian type, so I'd really be interested to see, and I don't know if anybody's ever really done that same kind of study of what if that same money had been invested in the private economy, even in private school and healthcare options or whatever. It'd be a fun estimate to see. But, one thing that I think I don't even mention very much anymore, although I really should, and this is something that should really be part of this discussion in terms of the economic costs of the empire, is that the inflationary monetary policy of the Federal Reserve is in great part meant to make government spending seem not so expensive. And so maybe the major part of the Greenspan-Bernanke bubble that popped in 2008 had been generated by a lot of monetary inflation in order to goose the economy, when really we were in the beginning of a recession when Bush Jr. took power. And Wall Street got literally hit on September 11th. The airlines and all these things, we were due for a recession. But instead of having one, they just hit the gas pedal on the money in order to really make Iraq seem free, so they could have a bonus war. They even sent people $300 checks in the mail as though it was their dividend from the profits of invading Iraq or something like that, when in fact it was costing all of us trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars, but it was the delayed effect. They made it seem free and almost got away with it, right? It was September 08. Bush almost was out of power before the thing fell. And thank goodness at least was still on his watch when the thing came crumbling down. But all the unemployment and all the people hurling themselves out of windows and all these things, that was the cost of the Iraq War finally come due for the American people. And only they were experiencing it in terms of time spent in the unemployment line and, wondering if their family was going to make it.
Yeah. Here's the problem, though. I think a lot of people have been sold the idea that military spending, the sort of financial, monetary issues aside, most people will argue with you that military spending on these wars has been good for the economy. They say, we look at it, it's a real stimulus package of a sort.
Right. And yet here we are. After 15 years of war, after 25 years of post-Cold War militarism, and everybody's broke. And they say this is the recovery, right?
Right. But I think, just for your listeners to be able to, hear some of this analysis, I think is really valuable because, again, you'll be in conversation with friends and neighbors and hear this. And I think, the answer, the economist's answer is no, military spending does not stimulate the economy in the way that these other forms do, because it is a less labor intensive industry. There's very, very many fewer people who do that work, even though we have a large standing army. The actual construction of weaponry and so on is not now, a big sort of mass industrial model. It's sort of craft, small batch, kind of work. Healthcare, education, it's all people-based, right? It's teachers and nurses and doctors and so on. So labor intensity is so different in the military and other sectors. The domestic content is much higher. The dollars stay in the United States, when you're spending on, education, obviously, for example. And for Iraq and Afghanistan, a lot of those dollars are going, overseas to foreign contractors or contract workers, in other countries. You've got, higher compensation per worker in the military, because again, a lot of these military industry, corporation, the corporate contracts result in, again, per capita higher wages. The lowest ranking service members are not, of course, paid as much, but again, compared to clean energy, construction workers, and so on. So between those three things, that you end up with much more benefit to your community with domestic, right, non-military spending.
Right. And again, we're talking about tanks for blowing things up, not tractors for reaping crops and feeding people. Right, we're talking about things that only destroy rather than multiplying out. Other capital goods are made for improving life, right, rather than just detracting. So,
on the other hand, what actually people who sell the idea of military solutions for everything are selling is the idea of security. Right? They're not selling a tractor to make food. They're selling the myth, the fantasy that this is going to keep them safe.
Right.
That
and
all
then
of
in
this
fact they're
investment,
polluting some field with depleted uranium in somebody else's country so they can never safely eat it again. Eat
well,
their own
again,
crop.
yes, the long-term health impact of war, the indirect reverberating effects are again the long gift that's going to keep on being gifted to the people of Iraq and Afghanistan, unfortunately.
Yep. All right. Well, listen, I really appreciate your time on the show. I'm sorry I've kept you so long here. We didn't have time to talk about the whole new nuke project and all that, but maybe we can focus on the costs there in the future as well.
Maybe another time.
We hope they're do-nothing nuclear missiles, as Mr. Burns on The Simpsons calls them, and that they're never used. But assuming that they're never used, boy, what a waste of money there. And if they are used, what an even worse waste of money. So, yeah. Anyway, really appreciate your time. It's been great, Catherine.
Oh, great to talk with you, Scott.
All right, y'all. That is Catherine Lutz. She is at Costs of War. It's the Watson Institute at Brown University. It's watson.brown.edu/costs of war. Just type in costs of war. And, recently there was a good article at Al Jazeera about this as well by Rami Khouri, the frighteningly high human and financial costs of war that you can read up to. Thanks, y'all. Scott Horton Show. Check out the archives and sign up for the podcast feed at scotthorton.org. Help support scotthorton.org/donate, and follow me on Twitter at Scott Horton Show.
I love Bitcoin, but there's just something incredibly satisfying about having real, fine silver in your pocket. That's why commodity discs are so neat. They're 1-ounce rounds of fine silver with a QR code on the back. Just grab your smartphone's QR reader, scan the coin, and you'll instantly get the silver spot price in Federal Reserve notes and Bitcoin. And if you donate $100 to the Scott Horton Show, he'll send you one. Learn more at facebook.com/commoditydiscs. commoditydiscs.com.
This part of the Scott Horton Show is sponsored by Audible.com. And right now, if you go to audibletrial.com/Scott Horton Show, you can get your first audiobook for free. Of course, I'm recommending Michael Swanson's book, The War State, The Cold War Origins of the Military-Industrial Complex and the Power Elite. Maybe you've already bought The War State in paperback, but you just can't find the time to read it. Well, now you can listen while you're out marching around. Get the free audiobook of The War State by Michael Swanson, produced by Listen and Think Audio at audibletrial.com/Scott Horton Show. Hey, y'all, Scott Horton here for WallStreetWindow.com. Mike Swanson knows his stuff. He made a killing running his own hedge fund and always gets out of the stock market before the government-generated bubbles pop, which is, by the way, what he's doing right now, selling all his stocks and betting on gold and commodities. Sign up at WallStreetWindow.com and get real-time updates from Mike on all his market moves. It's hard to know how to protect your savings and earn a good return in an economy like this. Mike Swanson can help. Follow along on paper and see for yourself. WallStreetWindow.com.